creepy horror stories.
The Calypso had once been humanity's crowning achievement, an advanced flagship designed for deep space exploration. Its mission was to venture beyond known space, seeking new worlds and unraveling the mysteries of the cosmos. Its crew was a hand-picked group of elite explorers, each an expert in their field. Yet, after a final garbled transmission, a chorus of distorted voices, followed by a single scream, the Calypso vanished from the stars. The signal abruptly stopped, and the ship disappeared, leaving no trace. A decade passed before a new mission was launched. The Atlantis was sent to find the Calypso, but what awaited its crew was more horrifying than they could have imagined. The Atlantis hung in orbit around the Calypso, a dark and looming presence in space. Captain April stood at the helm, her eyes fixed on the decaying ship below. The crew felt a growing sense of dread, an overwhelming feeling that something was terribly wrong. "We don't know what we're walking into," Captain April said over the intercom, her voice steady but strained. "Stay sharp, everyone." Molly, one of the crew members, felt a cold knot twist in her stomach. She'd heard about the Calypso's disappearance, but now that they were here, standing in its shadow, the reality was unbearable. The last transmission had been filled with static, followed by a scream. It was a cry for help, but it sounded so distant, as though it had come from another time. A time that had long since passed. The airlock doors to the Calypso creaked open, releasing a cold, stale breath that made Molly's skin crawl. She entered first, her boots clicking against the metal floor. The interior was dark, save for the faint glow of her flashlight. The ship was abandoned, its air thick with dust and the smell of old machinery. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant hum of the ship's failing systems. Molly's heartbeat quickened as she moved deeper into the ship. Her flashlight swept over long, empty corridors, walls covered in layers of grime. As she passed one of the rooms, she saw what appeared to be strange, claw-like markings etched into the walls. They looked fresh, as though something had scratched them not long ago. The ship felt wrong. It wasn't just abandoned, it felt like it had been waiting for them. Her eyes caught a broken mirror at the end of the hallway. The glass was cracked, its edges jagged. When she looked into it, she saw her own reflection, but not as she knew it. Her face was twisted into a grotesque smile that stretched impossibly wide, and her eyes gleamed with an inhuman hunger. Molly stumbled back, her breath shallow. It was just a trick of the light. The isolation, the years of abandonment, they were playing with her mind. But as her heart raced, she knew deep down that something wasn't right. Something inside this ship was waiting for them. "Stay focused," she muttered to herself, forcing her mind to stay sharp. The crew continued through the ship, searching for clues. But soon, odd sounds began to fill the silence, scratching noises, soft whispers like voices speaking just out of reach. At first, it was nothing more than a strange sensation at the edge of their minds, but the whispers grew louder, clearer, and more insistent. They seemed to come from every direction, beneath the floorboards, from within the walls, and even from the broken mirrors. "Captain, we've found something," Carter's voice crackled over the comms. Molly followed him to the main hall, her flashlight bouncing off fractured mirrors lining the walls. The mirrors were old, some cracked, some shattered, but they shimmered with unnatural energy, as though they had never fully given up their reflection. Molly couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Her skin prickled with unease as she passed a mirror, then stopped dead in her tracks. Her reflection was grinning at her, a twisted, malevolent grin that didn't match her own expression. Her eyes, wide with terror, seemed to gleam with an inner hunger, as though she wasn't alone in the mirror. The reflection's mouth stretched unnaturally wide, its teeth sharp and jagged. "Get away from the mirrors!" Molly shouted, her voice breaking the tense silence. She backed away, but it was already too late. The creature in the mirror lunged forward, its form shifting and warping as it crawled out from the cracked surface. Its limbs bent at unnatural angles, like something that had never meant to exist in the real world. The reflection in the glass screamed, but the voice that echoed through the chamber was not human, it was distorted, cold, and filled with rage. The rest of the crew, unaware of the nightmare unfolding in the hall, were still scattered throughout the ship, searching for survivors. But then, the mirrors came to life. Creatures, twisted reflections of the crew, emerged from the glass, each one a mockery of the people they had been. Their faces were warped, their bodies stretching in grotesque forms. They were no longer human, they were reflections of fear itself. Molly tried to warn the others, but one of the creatures lunged at Carter. Its claws sank deep into his throat, choking off his scream as it dragged him into the nearest mirror. His body contorted, his skin twisted and stretched as it disappeared into the reflection, leaving only the sound of shattering glass behind. "No!" Molly screamed, but before she could react, another creature turned toward her. Time seemed to distort as the creatures closed in. Molly struggled against the weight of her own body, but her limbs felt heavy, as though she were drowning in an invisible force. Her reflection, the one that had once been her, moved with impossible speed, its face morphing into something darker, more menacing. "Join us," the creature whispered, its voice a rasping echo in her mind. "You are already one of us." Molly fought back with every ounce of strength she had, but the creature's power was overwhelming. Her reflection, twisted, nightmarish, grinned wider. The glass beneath her fingers crackled as she reached for it, her hand trembling with fear. In a final, desperate move, Molly thrust her hand into the mirror, shattering the glass into 1,000 shards. But the moment her skin touched the jagged edges, the mirror pulled her in, dragging her through the broken glass into a dark, twisted version of the Calypso. Molly awoke in a place that was no longer the Calypso. The ship had changed. The walls warped, stretched, and bent at impossible angles. The lights flickered, casting erratic shadows across the halls. The Calypso had become something else, alive, pulsating with an unnatural energy. Molly was no longer in control. The ship had taken her. Her reflection in a nearby mirror didn't belong to her anymore. It grinned at her with hollow eyes, its face stretching wider than humanly possible. "You belong here now," it whispered, its voice thick with malice. "We are one." When Molly reached for the mirror, it shattered into 1,000 pieces. The fragments hung suspended in the air, as if held by some unseen force. Slowly, they reassembled into her reflection, but it wasn't her anymore. It was something twisted, something dark. Meanwhile, aboard the Atlantis, Captain April and the remaining crew fought to survive. The creatures, twisted reflections of themselves, were everywhere, spilling from the mirrors. The ship's structure seemed to distort, groan, and twist as if the Calypso were alive, feeding off their terror. Captain April swung her weapon at the nearest reflection creature, but it passed right through it. The creature grinned at her, a grotesque parody of her own face. The crew was falling, one by one, dragged into the mirrors, their bodies contorting as they disappeared into the glass. "Get to the escape pods!" Captain April yelled, but her voice was drowned out by the growing chaos. The ship groaned, warping in on itself as the creatures consumed it. Years later, the Odyssey arrived at the Atlantis, drawn by the faint distress signal still emanating from the wreck. The crew of the Odyssey, unaware of the horrors waiting for them, boarded the Calypso. They found Molly, or what was left of her, in the same control room where she had once stood. She was pale, lifeless, her eyes empty and hollow. But as Lieutenant Maria approached, Molly's head turned slowly, her lips curling into a twisted grin. Her eyes burned with a predatory light. "Do you know where you are?" Molly whispered, her voice sickly sweet, dripping with malice. "You're one of us now." Before they could react, the mirrors shattered. The creatures poured out from every reflective surface, twisted mockeries of the Atlantis and Odyssey crews. The creatures spoke in one chilling voice. "We are one." The crew of the Odyssey screamed as they were dragged into the mirrors, their bodies contorting in agony. The reflection creatures, once crew members of the Calypso, Atlantis, and Odyssey, had claimed their new victims. The cycle had begun again.